So most of us are involved in the climate action movement, and so we all talk a fair bit about climate change, but I don't think that I need to tell you that there's a wider collective silence around it. I imagine that many of you have had that same moment that I did of waking up and thinking, oh my God, this is the most urgent issue of our times. Everything that we love is under threat. How could it be that football and reality TV really seem to matter so much more? So you may have heard that the nature of climate change makes our brains want to ignore it. And this is for some really fascinating reasons. But what we're looking at today is some of the things that we can do about that, some of the reasons that we don't talk to each other, and how we can. Now, some time ago, a sociologist called Kari Norgaard investigated why many people who accept the reality and severity of climate change continue to act as if nothing is happening. And she found that there's a web of social, cultural, emotional, and that's really important, emotional and political factors that all conspire to keep people from admitting what they know to themselves and taking action on it. And she called this socially organised denial. Now, one point that she makes is that we all block out or distance ourselves from certain information because acknowledging that information would challenge three ideas that we hold on to desperately. The first is that we are good people. The second is that our world is stable and secure. And the third is that we have agency, the power to make a difference. And climate change brings all of those into question. Now, she also says that speaking openly about climate change and about the fact that we're in a society in denial, it helps people turn to face it. You know, we all know that fears are less paralysing when faced openly. And so simply speaking to others regularly about climate change is pretty powerful climate action. So let's look at some of the elements that contribute to this collective silence. And the way that CCL works already provides an antidote to these, which is part of the reason that I think it's such an amazing organisation. So climate change is depressing. So much of what you read and hear is pretty doom and gloom. And at a party, you probably don't want to be the person bringing everyone down, bringing this topic up again. It triggers feelings of powerlessness. Most people don't know what to do. It seems utterly overwhelming. And it also triggers feelings of guilt. With our Western lives, we're really all implicated. It's also potentially polarising and socially fraught. Now, if you know someone's position is the same as your own, it can feel a bit like speaking in an echo chamber and you're not sure if there's much point, you know. But if you're not sure of someone else's position, then it kind of seems safer not to mention it. You know, you don't want to get caught in an argument with a denier. It might be awkward, goodness forbid, you know, and you might not know enough to convince them. We worry about doing it right, and so we don't do it at all. So let's just look at those one by one with a couple of tips. So countering depression. Now, our solutions focus really makes a difference here. As well as talking about the possibilities of carbon fee and dividend, we need to make sure we're spreading the many positive stories that are already happening. Now, you may have heard that climate change can be framed as a disaster or as an opportunity. And so we need to be using that opportunity frame when we can. If you need ideas, the Renew Economy website is really good for that, and also the CCL Australia public Facebook page and the private Facebook group. Countering feelings of powerlessness. Now, we all feel powerless about climate change sometimes, but a lot of people get stuck there. You know, they've voted, they've shared petitions, they might even have written to their MP, but nothing really came of it, you know. And the truth is that we need to connect with other people and be challenged and empowered by them to take regular action. And this usually means getting involved with an organisation like CCL, because a group which is all pulling in the same direction is an incredibly powerful force, and it has momentum that picks people up when they're feeling pretty low and helps them to rise up again and carry on. And so we ourselves are really an antidote to this one, along with the many other wonderful organisations out there. And so talking about us and sharing the feelings of empowerment that you get from being involved in an organisation is a big part of that. Now, countering fears of social awkwardness. In fact, surveys show that a large majority of Australians already believe that climate change is happening, and a majority believe that it's caused by humans. Now, depending on which study and what they're asking, less than 10% and sometimes less than 5% of Australians actively dismiss the idea that climate change is happening. And we will be looking at some tactics for dealing with them later. But when you realise that most people agree with you already, it really feels easier to speak up. And as climate advocates, we really do need to be speaking because, you know, our brains don't want to think about it. And so the only other group who's motivated to speak are the hardcore dissenters. And if they're the only people that other people hear, then what are they going to believe? So we're going to be talking now about talking to that majority who do already basically agree with you, although they may not have been paying a lot of attention. And then we'll look at some techniques for handling dissenters, because worrying about running into one of them is a big reason that people don't speak. So the most important thing to remember when talking to anyone is to put the personal relationship first. And you've got to be sensitive to the other person. You know where they're at, what they're telling you verbally and non-verbally. There's that saying, you can't put the cart before the horse. And I think of the conversation that we're about to have about climate change as the cart. You know, it potentially carries a lot of baggage. It's a big load and it might have a long way to go to get from where they are to where you are. And so the horse is the relationship. You've got to look after the horse. You've got to feed it and treat it with respect. Otherwise, your cart isn't going anywhere. But that doesn't mean that you have to wait to be best mates before talking about climate change. In fact, I think that we all need to find ways of dropping the words climate change into conversations with anyone about anything. Of course, it is a balance. You don't want to be a bore, but I think that most of us can push ourselves a little bit more. So, for example, if somebody that I don't know terribly well says something about how incredibly hot or wet or dry it is, I might well say, yeah, with climate change, I'm really starting to get worried about how it's going to be in 10 years. And of course, this is a bit depressing. So if I can, I'll follow it up with about how I'm getting involved and how that's helping me feel positive and hopeful about the future. Or if somebody asks me what I'm doing on the weekend, I might tell them that I'm writing a letter to my MP and that might open a conversation, you know. So it's quite possible that they won't pick up on the subject. They might look a little bit awkward or pained when you raise it. And it's not necessarily because they don't believe in climate change. I've learnt this from experience. You've just got to not worry, you know. You've got to count every mention that you get in as a win. I really like to think of them as seeds, you know. Some of them won't sprout or they won't sprout for some time. But if you plant enough, then the change will grow all around us. The more that people sense that this is something that people like them are concerned about, the sooner they will also want to take action. Ordinary people like us are really important messengers for our communities and our networks. But we also need to think about the opportunities that we have to talk with other people who might not think exactly like us. So, for example, I chat with other parents at school drop-off or at a playgroup, and I spoke with my doctor about it the other day. You might talk to colleagues at work or people at a bus stop, you know. I actually think that we need an app so that we can get social and compare how many mentions we've made of climate change over a week and kind of gamify the whole thing. So if anyone knows how to make apps and wants to get onto that, then I would love to hear about it. Now, if you do sense that the other person is open to it, you might like to drop in a recent weather record to give them something to repeat to their friends, or if they're not sure about climate change, then something to add to the yes, climate change really is happening kind of pile in their heads. So for example, right now, you know, globally, the last 3 years have been the hottest ever recorded. You know, that's pretty big. It's also really great to mention local impacts. So I'm in Queensland, and the Irukandji jellyfish, which are those tiny, weeny, deadly jellyfish, have been expanding their range down the coast. And they were just found at Fraser Island, which is really not that far north of me. Now, while you're talking, you need to make time to listen. So in the midst of conversation, it's easy to forget to do this, but just keep trying, basically. So aim to find out what the other person is interested in or worries about, and maybe talk about how climate change will affect that. So they might be into fishing or just spending time with their family. They might be worried about the jobs market or refugees, and it might be really obvious to you that it's connected, but it might not be obvious to them. The truth is that our whole human world is based on the assumption of a stable climate. So everybody that you know has a million reasons to care. They might just not realise it yet. And remember, in the midst of this, to turn towards positivity whenever you can. It's a really good idea to have some positive stories stored up and ready to share. And the most powerful story that you can share may well be your own. And this is especially true if you sense that the person that you're speaking to feels overwhelmed by climate change. And that's quite likely if they're left-leaning. So you can tell them how you moved from being overwhelmed to taking action. You can tell them how much better you feel now you're getting involved. And then if they're open to it, invite them to take action. Ask them if they'd like to know more. And if they don't want to, then that really is fine. Don't hassle them. If you leak a feeling of judgment into your words, then they might not want to speak to you about it again. But if they do want to take action, then that's amazing. Invite them to join CCL, to come along to the monthly meeting. If you've been involved for a while, it can be really easy to forget that it's scary to do something new. And so make it as easy as you can for them. Make sure that you invite them personally, offer to carpool with them if it's a face-to-face meeting, or check in with them to remind them if it's an online meeting. Now, when you mention climate change, be alert to changes for the other person's energy. If they seem to want to disengage, then let them. This is about the relationship. If you feel them getting angry, maybe they even say something dismissive or outright aggressive, then you need to change your tack. And this is a kind of Zen paradox, to have any hope of changing somebody's mind in an emotionally charged issue, you need to largely let go of changing their mind for the moment, but still hold on to the relationship and continue the conversation. There's so much research out there that shows that arguing with other people only entrenches their views. Of course you're right. I know it and you know it, but it doesn't really help us. So we've got to be smarter than that. Now, just to clarify, of course, I'm talking about one-on-one discussions here. In the public sphere, it's a bit different. So, deep breaths. The first step is to defuse from your own emotional reaction. And this can be tricky, You're quite possibly feeling a bit emotionally slapped. Your palms might get sweaty, your heart might be pounding. And it's really useful to notice at this point what stories you're telling yourself. The ones that I find myself in are, I've got to change your mind, or I'm right, you're wrong. But these are really just stories, In the scheme of things, this conversation probably doesn't matter that much. And the truth is that maybe they're right about a whole bunch of things, and I'm wrong about stuff, So I try to take a deep breath and just silently name the story in my head, If I can manage to think I'm getting into my I must change you story, then I'm really much more able to let it go, and there's a whole theory about why this works, but it's enough to know that it does work. I put a link to a book that you might want to read in the notes if you're interested. It's really worth thinking about beforehand what sort of stories you get into when you're challenged, or reflecting on this afterwards if you've just had an interaction with somebody. And it's really useful in the rest of your life too, so it's a great skill to practice. So then I take another deep breath and I get curious. I might ask, so what do you think about climate change? And this is all about energy. You've got to ask as if you really want to know the answer. You've got to let go of being right. You've got to let your agenda become simply finding out what they think and building the connection between you. And what this means is that rather than being stuck in an argument with them, you're conducting reconnaissance, trying to find the best place to build a bridge. Now, as they speak, reflect what you're hearing back to them. So you might say, "Oh, seems like you're not convinced," or, "Oh, you think it's a bit of a beat up." No, you're not agreeing. You're letting them know that you've heard them. If they feel that you've heard them without your defenses coming up, then they're much more likely to be able to listen to you in turn and to respect what you have to say. And as they speak, agree warmly with whatever you can. Try to start whatever you have to say with an agreement. It'll really help them to be able to hear you in turn. And so you might say, "Yes, you're absolutely right. Scientists can be wrong about things. They have been before, they will be again." But disagree respectfully whenever you need to. Hold your beliefs. So you might follow that on by saying, "Look, when such a large majority of scientists all agree, I really think that they're probably right." And by doing this, by maintaining a connection with them and yet showing that you disagree, you're making it so much harder for them to just discount your views. There's an excellent video done by George Marshall on this that I've put in the notes about talking to deniers that goes into more detail. I really recommend you watch it if you're interested. And just going back to the horse and cart, whenever someone reacts badly, you just have to realize that they have a long way to go on their journey. And your goal isn't to magically convert them into a climate advocate. Your goal in this one conversation is just to bring them a little bit closer to you, and for them to be open to another conversation. It may well not be you who changes their minds. It may well be somebody in their kind of tribe, somebody more conservative perhaps, or whatever. But you're laying the framework for that. You're kind of ploughing the ground, I guess. Now, it really seems absurd, given the urgency of the issue, to have to move so slowly, but it's really that Zen paradox again. For people with their defences up, this slow way is the fast way, and it's often the only way. So if they throw up red flags, perhaps trying to get a rise out of you, then you can feel free to ignore that and just continue trying to build a connection with them, or you can feel free to just let it go for the moment and walk away knowing that you tried. But afterwards, reflect on what you did, on what you could have done better and on what you're proud of. Because raising this topic respectfully and intelligently again and again is really something that you should be proud of. So that's it, really. Breaking the silence is up to us. It's the only way that we're going to build the momentum that we need. So let's get out there and make our voices heard.